I love video games too.
Yeah. Is that what you like, Bruno?
No.
No. I remember when I was a kid looking at a map of African colonial times and seeing this one, you know, you had all this blue and pink of French Africa and British Africa, and then there's this one little patch sort of there on the belly of Africa that was gray or some color that didn't fit into the colonial map. And I wondered, you know, how did that stay independent? And then heard about the story, you know, in passing. You know, you learn about it a little bit in high school, a little bit in college, about the black people from North America who went back and how they created the first black republic. And then later, when the coup happened in 1980, the Doe coup against the old regime of William Tolbert, and I saw those horrifying pictures that everybody saw of the members of the old regime's government lined up on the beach, tied to telephone poles and machine gunned by this coup leader, Samuel Doe, and wondered, you know, what had led to this terrible tragedy. You know, I sort of left it aside for a while, and then years later I kind of came back to it, and the story that I discovered as I did my research, I went to Africa a couple of times, went to Liberia a couple of times for extended stays, was far more fascinating than anything I could have imagined. The idea behind the American colonization project was a mixed one. You had people like Robert Finley, who you mentioned was a reverend, who believed, who's a northerner, liberal, open-minded man, believed that African Americans in the United States were getting a raw deal, not being served very well. He kind of came up with this idea that we need that there was no way that black people would be able to get a fair deal in America, and that the best option for them was to go back to a land that they could call their own, that they could govern over themselves. So he was one side of the equation. People like him, northern evangelicals, Christians mostly, who felt that this was a noble cause. On the other side, you had people like Thomas Jefferson, who these were sort of progressive-minded planters. They owned slaves, but many of them felt that slavery was a doomed institution, that it wasn't going to last. It didn't make economic sense. It just wasn't fated to survive in the modern world. But he also believed that, again, African Americans could not live among whites, that the two races were so very different that they had to be separated. At one point he had said that, you know, when the Romans liberated their slaves, it was one thing, the ancient Romans, because they were of the same race. But he said, we have a greater problem. We can't integrate these two races. Then there was also, among planters like him, many of them wanted to liberate their slaves. Many of them were influenced by the ideals of the American Revolution. All men are created equal. Now these were, granted, this was a small minority of progressive-minded slave owners. Most slave owners had no intention of releasing their slaves. This was the natural order of things. This is where their money was being made. They weren't going to release them. But there was a small group of progressive slave owners, particularly in the Chesapeake region of Virginia and Maryland, who felt that, yes, we need to free our slaves at some point. But the racist assumptions of the day was that they couldn't stay here. In fact, many southern states passed laws that said, if you free your slaves, they got to leave. They got to get out of here. We don't want this growing free black community. And in fact, the free blacks were the fastest growing community in the early republic. Their population was growing very rapidly, and it worried people for racist reasons and also for practical reasons. And so the idea grew that we needed to get them out of here. And so a bunch of these slave owners, these progressive-minded slave owners, along with these northern evangelical liberals like Robert Finley, met in Washington, D.C. in 1816, in December, and they created the American Colonization Society. And the thing about the American Colonization Society was this was not a fringe group. This was the movers and shakers of Washington, D.C. These were the power brokers. Some of those powerful men in the land were there because the abolitionists who get we hear their heroic story of fighting slavery. They were a small radical fringe group that was not widely appreciated or accepted in Washington, D.C. This was the mainstream consensus. This was the conventional wisdom. If we're going to free the slaves, we've got to get them out of America. They don't have a right to be here. And so the American Colonization Society was founded on that principle. The man who presided over that meeting was nobody less than Henry Clay, who was the Speaker of that U.S. House of Representatives, the second most powerful politician in America after the President, chaired the meeting. And Monroe, the President, who became President shortly after the meeting, was a paid-up member of the Virginia Auxiliary of the American Colonization Society. So this was not a fringe group. This was mainstream, powerful politicians behind this. They usually had their way paid for by the American Colonization Society, which engaged in a massive fundraising drive mostly in churches, evangelical churches, both in the North and in the Chesapeake region of the South. Many of them were mulattoes. Many of them were mixed race people. Many of them were literate. They left. One reason, and the most prominent reason, I think, was just life was miserable if you were a free black in America in the early 19th century. You were treated as a second-class citizen. You had no rights. You were offered no dignity, no self-respect in this country. It was an incredibly racist republic. These people were feared, they were despised, even in the North, even in northern cities. A second motivation for them was they saw opportunity. They thought of themselves, many of them had trades, some of them were small-time businessmen, and they saw the opportunity to make money in Liberia. The third motivation was that many of them were evangelicals themselves and believed that Africans needed the Word of God brought to them. They needed the message of, eternal salvation and Christianity for the purposes of liberating their fellow Africans, the people who they saw as their ancestors, from the darkness of paganism. The Elizabeth set sail out of New York Harbor. It was the first ship to go to Liberia, sponsored by the American Colonization Society. It was freezing cold in New York that particular week when they left. The harbor was iced in. Temperatures were colder in those days than they are now. Well, one child died on the ship of fever or something, and their family disembarked, and the child was buried in a black church in New York. And then a couple other families also left. We don't know exactly the reasons for it. The Elizabeth then set sail and had a rough crossing, stormy crossing. They had a particularly troubling moment when they came across a ghost ship in the middle of the ocean, abandoned by all its crew and passengers. Nobody knows why. And it had the eerie fact that it was also called the Elizabeth, and that must have put a fright into the passengers. But the voyage finally made it. I think it took 6 weeks, 2 months, I can't remember exactly, and landed in Sierra Leone. Daniel Coker was a very interesting man. He was the offspring, a very unusual and controversial at the time offspring of a black father and a white mother. Very scandalous at the time in Maryland. He was born in Maryland. And unusual also for the time. Usually under the old slave regime in the antebellum South, you received the status of your mother. So if your mother was free, you were free. In this case, however, for some reason we don't know, Coker remained a slave, living on the plantation of his father. He was a very precocious child, very bright, and became very good friends with the son of the planter. And the son, they became such fast friends, the son refused to go to school unless Daniel Coker went with him. So Daniel Coker received an education, unusual again for a slave child. And he was also a rebellious kid, and having an education, of course, for a black person was very taboo in the South. And he ran away eventually, made his way to New York, and entered the free black community there, and then was finally freed legally by being bought by a Quaker family. Quakers, of course, were strong abolitionists, and legally given his freedom, where he became a preacher in the free black community in Baltimore. Became kind of the de facto leader of the black settlers who went back to Africa on the ship the Elizabeth. He was on the Elizabeth. And Lot Carey was himself, he's a fascinating man himself. He came over on the second ship, the Nautilus. He was born a slave to a black mother and a black father on a plantation in Virginia. When he characterizes himself in later writings and in later interviews with him, he characterized himself as a hellraiser when he was a kid, you know, and as a teenager, just always getting into trouble, always pushing the boundaries of what was permissible for a young black man at the time. And, you know, drinking and gambling and doing all this sorts of things, especially because he was rented out. A lot of slaves were rented out in the Old South. And he was rented out and lived by himself in Richmond, Virginia, you know, the biggest city in Virginia at the time, where he ended up working in a tobacco warehouse. But the guy was so clever and so good with numbers, you know, just naturally intelligent, and also had become literate. He was also one of the rare slaves who learned how to read and write. He rose up in the ranks of the tobacco warehouse because he was just so gifted at keeping track of things and taking orders and, you know, doing all the stuff that a clerk and a warehouse man would have to do, that he eventually rose up in the ranks. And, you know, as a rented slave, he would receive some of the money that went to his master, a small portion of it, and he saved it and he saved it and he saved it, and he eventually bought his way out of slavery, and his family eventually. He became a devout Baptist, a member in good standing of the leading church in Richmond, which was a semi-integrated church of blacks and whites. He was less interested in the American colonization project of settling African Americans in Africa. He was much more interested in spreading the Christian message to people he saw as his brothers across the sea.
After the abolition of slave trade, the British government had a lot of social, economic problems in the streets of London. All they could find is a place to kind of dispatch this population that is now destitute, poor in the streets of England. So that is how they move them to Sierra Leone, because already they tried an experiment in Jamestown off the coast of Nova Scotia. But that was a disaster, you know, where a lot of, you know, ex-slaves or free slaves, you know, suffered from the winter and disease, you know, that affected them in Jamestown off the coast of Nova Scotia.
The American government then decided to give the American Colonization Society $100,000. About $5 to $10 million in today's money. So not a huge amount of money. Certainly nothing up to the task of shipping back hundreds of thousands of slaves to Africa. But the idea was that the American government would use this $100,000 to set up kind of what they called repositories, places to place these liberated slaves on the slave trips sailing across the Atlantic, find a place to put them somewhere. So the American government participated in the colonization project to the extent that the colonization project would allow a space to repatriate these freed slaves that had been captured on the high seas by the American Navy. And so people succumbed, again, to malaria, yellow fever, and other diseases that these people had no immunity to. So they suffered immensely. The death rate in early years of Liberian settlement is among the highest in the world. And of course they faced the ongoing hostility with the native peoples there, who, even though they saw these settlers, they said, well, they look like us, but they dress like Westerners. And it's not surprising that the word that the natives gave to the settlers was the black white men, because they were, as far as the natives were, they were white men in their habits, in their attitudes, in their customs, except they were black. And the native Africans believed two things. One was that they had only agreed to sell this small island, not even sell, lease I should say, this small island in Monrovia Harbor at Cape Mesurado to the settlers. The American Colonization Society provided about $300 worth of goods in exchange for this. The American Colonization Society saw it as a straightforward deal. We give you this money, these goods, you give us the land. The Africans saw it very differently. They saw it as, these are gifts that you're giving us as a way to kind of smooth and lubricate an arrangement that we'll have, but we will still be in charge. We're not giving you this land permanently. So there's a lot of disputes. They met a lot of hostility from the local peoples because they were seen as outsiders by many. Many of the local tribes, sadly, were engaged in the slave trade themselves and felt that these outsiders might interfere with this because the local Africans weren't stupid. They knew who these people were. They knew that they were there as freed people from North America, and they knew that they were very anti-slavery. So there was a lot of distrust of these settlers. And so there were a number of wars fought between, a number of major battles fought between the natives and the settlers in the early years. The settlers having the better weapons and the better tactical advantage. They were better trained. They had trained as militias. They were able to fight off the native population and maintain a foothold on Cape Mesurado. It really took about 100 years for the Liberian government to finally exert its control over its territory. But the French and the British, used their greater power to slice away chunks of Liberia over the 19th century, until Liberia was shrunk to about 1/3 of its size, and to the size that we see it today on maps. The first president of Liberia was a man named Joseph Jenkins Roberts, and he was a relatively successful businessman from Virginia. And he was one of those guys who went over there probably mostly for business reasons. He saw opportunity there. The other thing about Joseph Jenkins Roberts, we were talking about him being a mulatto, was if you look at portraits of him now, photographs, he looks white, essentially. But in Virginia that day, the one-drop rule applied. If you had one drop of black blood, you were a black person. The liberation movement, the independence movement in Liberia in the 1840s, was not so much against the American Colonization Society, because they were ready to give Liberia up. It was against the poorer settlers. The poorer settlers of Liberia, they had a lot of distrust of these mulatto elites. Merchant mulatto Americo elites, they didn't like the fact the American Colonization Society was interfering with their economic freedom, and they decided to liberate themselves, you know, to declare independence. And their Declaration of Independence is a wonderful document to read, because it reads very much like the American Declaration of Independence, except that it has this wonderful preamble about, you know, we, the people of Liberia, were former inhabitants of North America, where we were treated like, just like the Americans posted a list of grievances against King George III of England, so they listed a list of grievances against the white people of North America, and that's why they had fled. But you'll notice in that first phrase, we the people of Liberia were once inhabitants of North America. And you realize that's only, they're just talking about themselves. 95% of Liberia had never lived in North America. So even in their Declaration of Independence, they're saying that Liberia belongs to us, the Americas, not to the natives. It belongs to us. In their declaration, the very first sentence is saying, we came from North America, ignoring the 95% of natives. And in that declaration, you can see the seeds of a long conflict that sometimes came out above the surface, most of the time was below the surface in Liberia, between the Americas and the vast majority of Liberians who were native.
Liberia experienced what we call basically the colonial settler effect, because the American Colonization Society and some other religious groups in the South kind of basically transplanted this population into Liberia, you know, where they officially started a state, a government. The natives were excluded from the government, from the major arms of government, or from participating in the government.
Abara findi maragirira dingera sima ngedira si gina kamera si duma di forira si o ga findi ga katora la gine